Hello everybody, this is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. Our lesson today is on imperialism and colonialism, terms we meet fairly frequently in newspapers, but most of all in history books. Our objective is to examine the terms colonialism and imperialism, but also to extend our understanding of what we mean by processes of decolonization and the post-colonial. First, a quick summary of colonialism itself. Colonialism was the process through which Europeans settled in various parts of the world, whether it was in Africa or Asia, South America or Australia. Colonialism was a process through which these white settlers, European nations, exploited local resources, settled and made families and nations, usually by decimating the native populations. Essentially, therefore, colonialism was an economic process where Europeans came into other parts of the world and made use of that space to further their commercial and economic interests. Imperialism is very distinctive from colonialism in a particular way. Colonialism, remember, was when the Europeans moved all the way from Europe into other countries and settled there. Imperialism does not involve settlement or conquest in that sense of the term. Imperialism is what you can think of as colonialism by remote control, that the Europeans staying within their European countries still determine the fate and future of other nations. They still are able to control economics, military, the political domains within another nation. So both essentially are about the exploitation of non-European countries and cultures by European nations. As we will see, race is a crucial component of this. In the first module, by way of introduction, we shall look at the terms and the nature of colonialism itself. The 14th century term colony, spelled C-O-L-O-N-Y-E, was derived from the Latin colonus, which means a farmer or a cultivator. It implied farming and settling down in a particular estate. The Roman colonia referred to the settlement of Roman citizens in a newly acquired country, as in the Romans would go to a different territory, occupy it and start farming. That used to be called a colony. Later, the term colonial began to mean particularly European colonies in America and other parts of the world. The Oxford English Dictionary now defines colonialism as, quote, an alleged policy of exploitation of backward or weak peoples by a large power. Colonialism, and this is something you need to understand and I shall reiterate it, is primarily a racial phenomenon. It's primarily about different races in a relationship of power where one race gets exploited by another race. Settler colonies are colonies like Canada and Australia, where the Europeans went and settled. Canada had its aboriginal native populations. Australia had its native populations, which were wiped out, and Europeans began to colonize it. The colonial policy was to discover the route to this place, settle there, start farming, and this is important, eventually claim that they owned the land. Therefore, settler colonialism is primarily about the acquisition of territorial possessions of property. Colonization often destroyed native cultures. They appropriated them, they rejected them, they rewrote them. This is the case with Asia, Africa, and South America. And within postcolonial studies now, postcolonial studies is now a full-fledged discipline, this destruction of native cultures, of native ways of thinking, of native systems of knowledge is one of the main focus of analysis. Colonialism had three significant components. The first and the most obvious is the governance of non-European nations and cultures through European law, European military, European medicine, and European political authority. The second component is the study of non-European cultures by European academics philosophers, historians, scientists. In effect, what I'm proposing is colonialism had a political component which was about governance, but it had a cultural component to do with studying the Orient or the Arab world. Finally, the third component is the slow transformation of non-European cultures due to the arrival of the Europeans. And we will spend much of what we are doing today on this third particular component. Our next component deals with the reading of colonialism's cultures. As you can see in the earlier module, I described the cultural components of colonialism. In 1978, Edward Said published a book called Orientalism, in which he argued that colonialism works best because the military, political and economic aspects are accompanied by the cultural aspects. So, colonialism is actually an effective use of power within cultural practices like literature, archaeology, history and others. European colonial powers developed modes of analysis that enabled further strengthening of their dominance. Colonialism had several ideologies, as in ways of thinking: dominance, difference, conquest, improvement, welfare and others. What's important is to note that these ideologies, these belief systems, were expressed not only in political statements but within the cultural realm. British novels about India, the painting of African savages by the European painters, all these constitute the cultural aspect of colonialism. These ideologies furthered European colonialism because they all promoted a very key binary: the superior European versus the inferior native. In other words, racism, imperialism, colonialism, all the three categories that you can think of, were made, reinforced, pushed into the native minds and assimilated not through questions of political power but through cultural practices such as education or fiction or literature, and eventually films and photography as well. Therefore, it's important to understand that it is culture that furthers the cause of colonialism, not only the white policeman with a gun. The white policeman with a gun is important. The white policeman with a gun stands for authority, oppression, power and the ability to brutalize you. But as Edward Said would argue in epoch-making ways, his book defined postcolonial studies for us, culture is what is significant because culture works unobtrusively. You don't discover the power relations because you think of it only as fiction or film. So our next module takes off at this logical moment on a particular theme: Colonial Culture 1, the civilizational mission. What do we mean by the civilizational mission? The civilizational mission was the Europeans' belief that the primitive, savage, pagan native could be improved because of the presence of the European. The civilizational mission was an attempt by the European to use educational, religious and other methods, essentially cultural methods, to improve the native. It worked on two domains: the material and the moral. The material dimension of the civilizational mission included the arrival of vaccines, the building of hospitals and schools, the building of railways, establishing law courts and others. But the key focus was not the material alone. The key focus was also the moral domain, where the colonials argued that the coming of Christianity, the coming of law, the coming of educational, scientific and aesthetic ideas would help the native become better. The civilizational mission was based on certain assumptions. on certain principles and beliefs. The European argued that native culture was inherently poor, primitive, pagan and undeveloped. The European believed that in contrast to the native, the European was at a higher level, as in there is a hierarchy of civilization and the races that sit at the top are the whites and the others stay here, and it is the duty of the ones at the top to help improve the ones at the lower levels. So the civilizational mission was based on a very clear binary, the inferior native versus the superior European. Without such a binary, without such a very clear ordering or hierarchy of races, the civilizational mission would not have been successful. So, as an example, we will say that the Europeans believed that the Indians could not educate themselves, they must be educated. The civilizational mission had several methods. I have mentioned a few: the rule of law and good governance, Christian charity, hard work, and the moral reform of natives. So the civilizational mission was based, one, on a very clear prejudice, on a very clear binary about the hierarchic ordering of races. It was also based very clearly on the assumption that it is the moral responsibility of the white race, and I am underscoring this, the moral responsibility of the white race to help improve the native. What do we understand from this? I mean, what is the conclusion we draw from this idea of the civilizational mission? It should be very obvious. The civilizational mission believed that the world is based on a continuum, on a hierarchic ordering, where the races are arranged this way, and the better race must improve the worse race or the less good advanced race. What do you think is a consequence of this line of thinking? You see, you can only improve people if you have power over them. In other words, the civilizational mission of charity, of law and order, of education, of aesthetics, of science, to improve the native was made possible because the English were in power. It was possible because the English and the Europeans had dominance over the natives. So the civilizational mission must not be seen as only manifest in a cultural realm as a set of ideas. No, not at all. The civilizational mission was intrinsic to, was integral to the very structure of power. Power works when you have physical authority over somebody, being stronger, but it also works because you have knowledge over the other and knowledge of the other. That brings me to the next module, which is on colonial culture 2, colonial knowledge. Central to colonial cultures was the building of an archive of colonial knowledge about the subjects. In order to rule, they needed to know. So in order to know, they built an archive, the imperial archive. I might at this point out to you that the materials on India published, produced, written by the British in the British Library, London, one of the world's largest libraries, if placed alongside each other, stretches to 18 miles of shelf space. 18 miles of materials have been produced by the British about India. Why did they do that? Why would you produce so much documentation about your colony? The answer is that it is only through an in-depth knowledge of the colony, of the native, of the various systems of religion, of caste, of class, of gender, that the British were able to dominate. So the colonial culture of knowledge documented festivals, legal systems, art, architecture, women, children, domestic public life, clothing, food habits of the natives. Works like Robert Ohm's, and I'm using here the two key texts of the 19th century, Robert Ohm's Historical Fragments of the Mughal Empire and James Mill's History of British India, published in 1782 and 1817 respectively, introduced India and its people to the English readers, especially those training to come out to India. There were geographic surveys, there were medical geographies of various parts of the country. Organizations such as the Botanical and Zoological Surveys of India, the Archaeological Survey of India were all set up in the 19th century. The Asiatic Society, founded in Kolkata in 1784, was one of the oldest such societies of colonial domination. The British saw it as their duty to produce such reliable knowledge about an ancient civilization such as India, and I am speaking primarily here of India as a colony, not about the others. James Prinsep, one of the pioneers in such archaeological and epigraphic work, secretary to the Asiatic Society, declared in 1818, this is what he said, and I am quoting: "What the learned world demands of us in India is to be quite certain of our data, to place the monumental record before them exactly as it now exists, and to interpret it faithfully and literally." In other words, what Prinsep is saying is, it is our duty to do this because the world expects us to do this. Remember what I said, that the sense of moral responsibility. Moral responsibility is also what leads the British to say, we need to document every aspect of Indian life, whether it's religion, architecture, law and order, it does not matter, we document it. So these so-called authentic documentation then become knowledge. Why is this important? Why should knowledge be reliable? You see, economic policies were based on the documentation produced. Political actions, activities and decisions were based on the knowledge and such documentation produced. That's one side. On the other, what's equally important is that the natives looking at these, studying these documents, were equally vulnerable to impression. That is, the natives begin to believe that what is being said in these English books is true. So, the preservation and conservation of monuments, the declaration of what Buddhism or Hinduism really means, all become archives for administrative and other programs. Knowledge gathering, in other words, was never a neutral act, it was a political act. The knowledge gathered resulted in political consequences. By demonstrating the inferiority of the natives, the Europeans were able to say, look at these natives, they are inferior, cannot govern themselves, they need to be governed. That is, only by positing certain tribes, people, communities as primitive, could they justify their presence in India. When they produce so-called authentic knowledge, they put in all possible stereotypes which indicated the primitiveness of Indian religion, which showed the primitiveness of Indian law and order system or the legal system. And they said, look at these natives. They don't have adequate knowledge about themselves. Let us give them knowledge. But this knowledge was one-sided, was biased, was clearly prejudiced. As a result of this, the natives begin to believe that what the English book says is true. Surely that's a dangerous game. And after political independence, the process that starts to look at this influence, this legacy of skewed prejudiced reading, is the process that we will now address in our next module, decolonization. Colonization, decolonization, the removal of the influences of colonization, has its roots in the cultural nationalisms of the 19th century. Tilak or Vivekananda or others, that revived festivals, local cultural practices, and said, our problem is our tradition, that is Indian traditions in various cultures and communities, have all been marginalized in favor of the English ones. What cultural nationalism says is, you have an Indian tradition which has been handed down to us, which the British come in and reject. They come in and reject it and say, all these native traditions and forms of knowledge and forms of learning are irrelevant. They need to be substituted. They substitute with English ones. Once they substitute it with English knowledge, we, as in the natives, the colonial subjects, begin to think only the English things are right. We begin to assume that our own knowledges are irrelevant. So decolonization is a critical method in the humanities and social sciences where the impact of colonization is studied, examined and overthrown. It believes that the colonial master's culture usually relied upon the native in two ways. It forced the native to abandon his own culture and assimilate the culture of the master, which is what I just said. The Indian tradition which exists is somehow rejected by the European. The native believes that what the European says about our traditions is right. We reject it ourselves. You rejected your tradition. Where else do you go? Once you have rejected your tradition, you then turn to English tradition itself. You pay more attention to what's going on in the English text and say that is the truth. Critical thinkers on decolonization, starting with people like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, argued that we begin to see ourselves through English eyes. The white man is the master. The white culture is the one to be desired and adopted. In Frantz Fanon's famous phrase, we have black skins, but we put on white masks. Decolonization has resulted in the revival of mysticism, folk cultural forms, native systems of medicine and spiritualism as alternatives to our colonial inheritance. Postcoloniality, which is a material condition of our lives now, refers to the economic and political conditions in which we live after acquiring political independence. It emphasizes the impact of global geopolitics, globalization and economic shifts upon material conditions. Today, in the late 20th and early 21st century, postcoloniality also examines attitudes towards third world workers, migration, refugee problems and others. It examines the new economic policies of the third world products, of third world tourism and others. It also looks at the context of military wars, campaigns against Arabs, Asians and South American nations, Asia as well. Most importantly and most frighteningly, post-colonial thinkers locate a continuity between earlier forms of colonialism and our present neo-colonial age. In other words, post-colonial studies is interested in seeing how former systems of colonization have continued in certain ways, have persisted in certain ways. They may not be exact replicas of the 19th century model, but they continue to have similar exploitative consequences. Globalization is seen as a form of colonialism now, has been the increase in fundamentalisms and regionalisms in various parts of the world. It's important to recognize that globalization is sometimes called neo-colonialism for a particular reason. Neo-colonialism is new colonialism. While the earlier forms of colonialism required military conquest, where the European actually moves to the Asian or African continents and takes over that piece of land and converts it into economic resource, the modern version of colonialism does not do this. Of course, there are wars, there are some kinds of conquest, but neo-colonialism works primarily through economic means. Free trade agreements, the control of the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund are manifestations of neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism, therefore, is, shall we say, a more shadowy, a more ghostly version of the older forms of colonialism. This has been studied by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, two very significant political philosophers, in a massive book called Empire, which was first published in 2000. Addressing the problem of neocolonialism, Hart and Negri argue that what we now see is an empire without a border, but we also see an empire without a capital. Now think about this. 19th century India was a colony of the British. Its capital was London. In the age of globalization, there is no central capital. Hart and Negri note that this empire is based on a large collection of multinational corporations, conglomerates, media networks, which do not necessarily have a central controlling city. It's dispersed, diffused. The Harton-Negri argument is therefore about an empire which is formless, shapeless. What is the advantage of such an empire? This is something very important. Previously, when you wanted to fight against an empire, this is the imperial master and we need to fight against it, you knew where to go. You knew there was London City, you knew the Europeans were responsible for it, and so on and so forth. Now, you do not know who the masters are. You do not know who controls you. Empire, the book of the title, argues that neocolonialism and globalization are more dangerous methods because it's so shadowy. It's formless, shapeless. It does not have territorial military conquests. It has territorial economic conquests. Think of free trade agreements. Who does the free trade agreement actually benefit? It benefits the first world. Empire, therefore, is a form of colonialism without the declaration of aggression, without war, but with the same consequences of war. Empire, therefore, is globalization as an extension of the colonial period from the 19th century. And Harton-Negri traced this to the rise of economic globalization somewhere around the late 80s and early 1990s. This empire is not, please understand, controlled by governments in the West. It's not by first world governments. The empire now is situated around business conglomerates, economic organizations, and massive corporations. So globalization with a diffused range of activities, with a diffused boundary and diffused circulation of capital, as in finance, and labor and commodities, actually means that we cannot pinpoint the contours of an empire. This empire, therefore, is shapeless. It doesn't have a capital. We know its effects, but we can only know it by its effects. We cannot see it. It has no face. Arguably, this is a far more dangerous empire. To quickly summarize what I have said so far, by way of conclusion, the establishment of colonialism as a principle was due to the establishment of a colony, which starts off as a farmer-settler system, but eventually becomes focused on the acquisition of territory and of property. Colonialism functioned not through military means, but economic as well. So that is one component of the colonial cultures that we need to be aware of, that colonialism functions as a political economic system, but it also functions primarily as a cultural system. And in our examination of colonial culture, such as the civilizational mission, we focused on the fact that colonialism has its greatest effect in the cultural domain. We spoke about the civilizational mission in some detail, where the native begins to feel that his civilization, his culture, his tradition has no value and ends up adapting and assimilating the culture of the English or European master. Speaking about decolonization, we noted that postcolonial thinkers, starting from Émile Séguer through Frantz Fanon and others, find that their inheritance of English or European colonial structures is a hindrance, not a help. Decolonization, as this process is called, is an attempt to retrieve, to go back to native ways of thinking, native systems of thought. Finally, decolonization is a marker of a post-colonial condition. The post-colonial condition is of political independence, where we do see a continuity between older forms of colonialism and things like globalization today. Themes in post-colonial literature, therefore, address not only colonial conditions in the 19th century, but the continuity of colonialism in the present day. It also sees fundamentalisms, tribalisms, and other regional action against the first world, quote unquote, as a response to globalization. Post-coloniality is a struggle for a reinvented self of the newly independent nations. Thank you.